If you lived in Australia during the late 90s or early 2000s, you couldn't escape the screaming commercials, the bizarre deals, or the feeling that someone was trying to shove a Nokia into your hand every time you walked past a shopping centre. I'm talking, of course, about Crazy John's. For a solid decade, Crazy John's forced its way into the centre of Australian culture. The brand operated with the chaotic energy of a drunk uncle at a barbecue who somehow turns out to be a financial prodigy. They dominated the streetscape with such aggressive confidence that, for a long time, they looked completely untouchable. Peel back the nostalgia for cheap Motorola's and ringtone commercials, and you find a genuinely grim narrative. The rise and fall of Crazy John stands as one of the most depressing case studies in Australian corporate history. Because behind the weekly mascot and the budget branding, there was a legitimate rags to riches empire built by one man. A man who fought the biggest monopolies in the country and won, only to lose everything in a way that feels almost scripted by a tragic novelist. To understand why Crazy John's was such a big deal, you have to understand the boring beige landscape of Australia before he arrived. In the early 1990s, mobile phones were not cool. They were bricks carried by investment bankers and people who shouted at their secretaries. The market was a duopoly, controlled tightly by Telstra and Optus. These giant telcos were slow, arrogant, and expensive. Walking into a Telstra shop in 1993 felt like applying for a loan at a bank. They dictated the prices and the terms, and they didn't care if you liked it or not because, well, where else were you gonna go? Enter John Ilhan. Born in Turkey in 1965, Ilhan's family migrated to Australia when he was 5 years old, landing in the working class suburbs of Melbourne. His parents worked in factories and they didn't have much. Ilhan grew up in Broadmeadows, an area that wasn't exactly churning out billionaires at the time. School didn't interest him nearly as much as the art of the deal. He was a natural-born scrapper, always working an angle from the back of the classroom. He briefly attempted to settle down with a university enrollment and a job on the Ford assembly line, but the prospect of a quiet, predictable existence terrified him. One day, he simply walked off the Ford assembly line, decided he wasn't going to spend his life building someone else's cars, and went into sales. Specifically, he started selling mobile phones at a chaotic little store called Strathfield Car Radios. And he was a natural. While other salespeople were trying to explain the technical specs of a car alarm, Ilhan was out on the floor, charming customers, cracking jokes, and moving units of these newfangled mobile phones like they were hotcakes. He realized something the big telcos didn't. Mobile phones shouldn't be treated like luxury items for the rich. They shouldn't be sold like commodities. In 1991, at just 26 years old, he decided to go for it alone. He scraped together a tiny amount of capital, some reports say it was as little as $1,000, and rented a small shopfront on Sydney Road in Brunswick. He initially wanted to call the store Mobile World, which is objectively a boring name. It was only when a friend's colleague looked at the prices Ilhan was slashing and remarked, "You blokes are crazy," that the light bulb went on. Ilhan paid a graphic designer exactly $20 to sketch a logo of a man with googly eyes and a wagging tongue, and he never changed it. That $20 scribble became the face of a company that, by the late 90s, was moving more volume than Telstra's own corporate outlets. The business model relied on a brilliant piece of financial arbitrage that completely broke the Australian market. Back in the early 90s, the mobile phone itself was an incredibly expensive piece of hardware. For most people, that entry price was a massive barrier. However, carriers like Telstra were desperate for subscribers. They were so desperate that they paid dealers a massive bounty or commission for every single person who signed a 24-month contract. The standard move in the industry at the time was that dealers would take the commission the carrier paid on each new contract and treat it as extra profit, while still charging customers hefty prices for the handset. Ilhan looked at those numbers and saw an angle. Instead of hoarding the commission, he used it to subsidize the phone, effectively funneling the carrier's incentive straight into the customer's pocket. Overnight, mobiles that had been out of reach suddenly became relatively affordable. He ran on razor-thin margins on the hardware and took a hit up front, but he made it back in volume. Every new customer meant more ongoing commission from the telco, and with the sheer number of people he was signing up, those trailing payments added up to millions. As the money rolled in, Ilhan's life began to look very different from his days on the Ford assembly line. We're talking about a net worth that eventually hit $310 million, landing him at the 126th spot on the rich list. He owned a mansion on Brighton's $1 Million Mile and bought a black Lamborghini that he refused to drive because he thought it was showing off and disrespectful to staff who were saving up for a mortgage. In fact, he famously didn't even know how to use a computer keyboard, preferring to run his $175 million a year empire through face-to-face conversations and sheer charisma. But beneath the crazy John persona and the public generosity, there was a drive born from genuine hardship. This was a guy who, as a kid in Broadmeadows, used to walk 4 kilometers to soccer training every single week, even when the coach refused to pick him for the team. He just kept walking until they made him captain. By 2003, that drive had cemented him as the undisputed king of Aussie retail. He was richer than Nicole Kidman, richer than Leighton Hewitt, and seemingly invincible. But you don't get to be that big, that fast, without making powerful enemies, and Ilhan's biggest enemy was also his biggest partner, Telstra. The relationship between Crazy Johns and Telstra was toxic. Telstra needed Ilhan because he brought in hundreds of thousands of customers, but they hated him because he had too much power. His customer service was better, his deals were sharper, and his brand was cooler. They resented the leverage he held over them, so in 2003, they decided to force his hand. At that point, Crazy Johns was a Telstra mobile dealer with around 900,000 customers, generating close to 20% of Telstra's mobile revenue, all by itself. Telstra executives issued a demand for the repayment of over $21 million in commissions, claiming their own IT systems had miscalculated the payments over several years. They hinted that if it wasn't paid within 5 days, the dealership agreement would be terminated. Most people would have panicked and signed a worse deal just to survive. Ilhan didn't. He wrote the check under protest to keep the doors open, then immediately sued Telstra for over $50 million, accusing them of unconscionable conduct. Over the next few years, the numbers only got uglier. Telstra followed up with a second demand for another $12 million in alleged overpayments, and Crazy Johns rolled that into its claim, arguing in court filings and the press that the telco was bullying a key dealer. By 2006, some reports were talking about Crazy Johns chasing more than $40 million back, and an appliance retailer report put the live lawsuit figure at $70 million. Whatever exact number you pick, the fight had clearly blown out into the tens of millions territory. By November 2006, both sides wanted out. They settled out of court, with Ilhan accepting a $2 million payment to drop the claims. According to coverage of the settlement, Crazy Johns agreed to walk away from the litigation and reimburse part of Telstra's internal costs, while Telstra in turn wrote a check for $2 million to close the book on the whole mess. He had survived the threat, but the relationship was over, paving the way for his switch to Vodafone and Crazy John's eventual rebirth as a Vodafone-based operator instead of Telstra's most troublesome dealer. By 2007, John Ilhan was on top of the world. He had diversified and was looking at expanding Crazy Johns into banking and insurance. He was talking about taking the brand global. He was a philanthropist, donating millions to the Royal Children's Hospital and setting up his own charitable foundation. He was a family man who adored his wife Patricia and their 4 children, and a local hero who never forgot the streets he came from. He was 42 years old, fit, healthy, and seemingly unstoppable. And then, on the morning of October 23rd, 2007, the unthinkable happened. Ilhan was out for his regular morning walk in Brighton, an affluent suburb of Melbourne. He was training, staying fit, and doing everything right, But while he was on a bike path, he collapsed. Passerbys tried to help and ambulances were called, but it was too late. John Ilhan, the man with the unstoppable energy, died on the sidewalk of a suspected heart attack. The news hit Australia hard. People like him aren't supposed to drop dead at 42. The tributes that poured in were genuinely emotional. John Ilhan had become such a vivid character in the Australian consciousness that his death felt like a genuine blow to the national culture. Official tributes came in from politicians, including the Victorian Premier, and even a message from the Prime Minister of Turkey, and thousands of people turned out to farewell him at his funeral. His death forever changed Crazy John's, because Crazy John's was him. The brand was built entirely on his personality. The chaotic energy, the risk-taking, the crazy moniker, it was all him. When he died, the engine of the company stopped. His widow, Patricia Ilhan, suddenly became the person everyone looked to. On paper, she now controlled the bulk of what John had built in real life. She was juggling 4 young children and the Ilhan Food Allergy Foundation the family had set up off the back of their daughter's peanut allergy. The day-to-day running of the chain sat with CEO Brendan Fleiter and his executive team, but the restless, improvising center of the business was gone. Patricia wasn't the one who'd spent years brawling with Telstra and fronting loud TV ads, but now she was the one left to decide what happened next, balancing a huge, fast-moving retail machine against the very real demands of her family and their charity. In 2008, just a year after John's death, she sold Crazy John's to Vodafone for a reported $150 million. Vodafone promised to keep Crazy John's alive. They said all the right things. They claimed they valued the unique culture and the independent spirit of the brand. They kept the stores open and they kept the signage, but almost immediately, the soul of the place began to rot. You see, a corporate giant like Vodafone doesn't know how to run a crazy business. They started standardizing everything. The weird, off-the-cuff deals disappeared. The chaotic store layouts were tidied up. The staff, who used to be hired for their personality and sales hustle, were replaced or retrained into corporate drones reading off scripts. Crazy John's stopped being a renegade discounter and started becoming just a Vodafone Lite. It was the same network, the same phones, but sold in a shop with blue paint instead of red. To make matters worse, Vodafone itself was about to enter its darkest era. In around 2010, the Vodafone network in Australia effectively collapsed. They had oversold their capacity and calls were dropping nationwide. It became known as Vodafail. Customers were fleeing in droves. There was a class action lawsuit and the brand's reputation was in the toilet. Crazy John's, now fully owned by Vodafone and running on the Vodafone network, was dragged down with the sinking ship. Ilhan's genius was that he could pivot. If a network was bad, he would have switched suppliers. If a phone wasn't selling, he would have slashed the price to $1. But Crazy John's was no longer agile. It was a zombie brand, chained to a failing parent company. By early 2013, the writing was on the wall. Vodafone Australia was bleeding money and needed to cut costs. Running 2 separate retail brands, Vodafone and Crazy John's, made no financial sense, and finally, they announced the closure. By July 2013, Cruise had pulled down the signage and redirected the website to a soulless Vodafone landing page. In the span of just a few months, the staff were scattered and a retail empire that generated hundreds of millions of dollars was completely erased from the map. It was a quiet, almost insulting end to a brand that had been so loud. Crazy John's represented an era of Australian business that doesn't really exist anymore. It was the era of the Larrikin Tycoon. Figures like John Ilhan didn't use focus groups. They didn't worry about brand synergy or corporate ESG scores. They operated on gut instinct and charisma. They built empires that felt human, flawed, and exciting. Today, our retail landscape is dominated by faceless conglomerates. We buy our phones from glass cubes run by Apple or sterile kiosks run by the major telcos. The prices are fixed, the plans are identical, and the deals are calculated by algorithms not by a guy trying to clear stock so he can pay the rent. There's no room for a crazy John in the modern economy. The barriers to entry are too high and the margins are too thin. But when you look back at the footage of those old commercials, yes, they are cringeworthy, loud, cheap, and tacky, but they're also full of life. They capture a moment in time when the economy felt open, when the internet hadn't homogenized everything, and when a guy from Broadmeadows could become the king of mobile phones. Crazy John's is gone. The stores are now probably bubble tea shops or generic news agencies. But for those who remember, Crazy John's represents a time when business was a little less predictable, a little more human, and a hell of a lot crazier. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part of it all is the question of what if? What if John hadn't gone for that run? What if he was still here today? Would Crazy John's have evolved into an online giant like Kogan? Would he have started an airline? Would he have run for politics? We'll never know. All we're left with is the memory of a guy in a wacky suit, a $1 phone, and a legacy that reminds us that in business, as in life, nothing is guaranteed, no matter how rich, how successful, or how crazy you are. The empire can fall just as quickly as it rose, and sometimes the only thing that remains is the story. But what do you think? Was the erasure of Crazy John's just inevitable corporate evolution? Or did Vodafone kill a golden goose by stripping away its soul? Do you miss the days when Aussie businesses were run by loud, chaotic characters? Or do you prefer the polished, faceless brands we have today? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching and stay curious.